So welcome. Thank you for choosing this session. My name is David Johns, and I'm Principal Product Manager Architect for the Microsoft tenant itself. So how do we manage, govern, how do we configure our own services for our own employee tenant? So effectively, internally, we think of it as the Microsoft corporate tenant. So we have to govern and manage that. And of course, with AI, it gets really important to think about what data exists. Because obviously, Copilot is how we know everything the employee has access to, which is great. I'll talk a lot about that. At the same time, Copilot's how we know everything the employee has access to. So we want to think about that and make sure you got it right. So we'll talk about how do we govern and manage a tenant. We'll talk about how we administer a tenant to make sure we're compliant in all the ways. This is going to be focused on a lot of Copilot-related things. Other governance topics I'll talk about on my Thursday section, where we're going to go a little more broad on some other tenant governance things like team meetings, recordings, a bunch of other things we'll talk about in more detail on that point too. So, with that, Ellie.
David. Hi everyone, good afternoon. I'm Eileen, the same with David. I'm the Principal Product Manager in MSIT. Assessing all the internal employee experience and customer experience to coordinate all the Microsoft portfolio adoption within the company. So let's get started by reviewing the landscape Microsoft Data has been managing internally. We will not unpack every detail as you can see on this way, but we want to share this included breadth and complexity about what's the environment we have been for employee. You can see we manage the experience across 150 countries that require us to navigate the local regulation, the legal requirement, and the cultures. And you also can see employees all collaborate across massive amount of the team's SharePoint site, as well as how many times they spend in meetings, daily basis, monthly basis. We want to empower everyone to get their job done in the productive way. At the same time, when we support them, we often thinking about scalability, how to set up the self-service, which David will have deep dive with us all together in this session, but also learn their feedback on a timely basis and adjust our approach. When we roll out Copilot for M365, we not only think about license management, but also reclicked how we really empower employee by setting up the guardrail and governance in an effective way. So before going to that, I also want to go through the way how we roll out the adoption approach, how we roll out the Copilot internally. If you have been in this session early this morning with Claire Season, and they already see this, and we want to start with this to revisit how this whole life cycle iterates. So internally, we start with implementation, and we will have drilled down very quickly about what does that mean to administration. But in addition to that, we will need to collaborate with all the fields and the business owners to identify the rollout strategy. And also because the company is big, as we just going through the landscape, we will need to manage the welcome experience and make sure once employee needs help, the support, the communication are all available for them. The next, compliance, privacy, security, and works council. And as we go across global, will be to review the legal requirement and regulation on an often basis. So here we talk much with HR, legal team, and also the field team on a regular basis. Going through all the feature, listen to their feedback, have Q&A. David was specifically going down detail about sensitivity level or this governance detail there. So. And the next is the employee readiness and direction. And many times as we need to go scaling approach, not only the team will define the readiness training curriculum, but also work with all the sponsorship in every organization and the field to get alignment. Then this can scale the readiness to all the region for the employee in the effective way and also consistency. And last but not least is the feedback loop. As when we engage employee, we hear feedback. And we need to close the loop instead of packing them. So many times we learn from employee what's working versus not, and incorporate that into our adoption approach, do the adjustment timely, and just rethink if the rollout approach needs to be further refined. So that life cycle will iterate a lot based on our rollout approach. Thank you, David. And by saying that, we will get zoom in a little bit into the implementation about how this means to IT admin and how this role can further support the rollout for the employee on the Copilot 2025. You might think like because we're in Microsoft, it is so straightforward, we just roll it out, enable all the license. Actually, the reality is it's not that simple. And many times that is collaboration across the role because within Microsoft, we started the journey 1 year ago. And we going through some phases at the beginning need to validate if everything works in a small group of validation, then gradually land it and scale that eventually reach out to the entire company. So meanwhile, we enable this to every employee on the tenant, but to circle back to a long time ago, very often we went to enemy, just let them know, hey, tomorrow when we get to go this, because we need to support the accelerated learning. So what will be the technical solution? And we usually look at us, will say, hey, tell me what's next, what's next? So many times this became a balance between how quick the change will need to be and how quickly they learn from it and can circle back to iterate versus how to scale, how to build up the sustaining model and eventually be ready for the further scaling in the future. So going through that whole phase, our learning is, first of all, need to settle down the sponsorship, which from the business side can discuss with the engineering side the strategy. Who will go first by role and which role and how to scale. And then finally, what the timeline is. That is in addition to the engineering detail about how to manage the license. Secondary, the engineering from the tenant service management perspective also thinks through the connection. When it started from small, going to bigger, what the best way eventually can scale that up. So our internal practice start with building up all the license on the security group. But then we realized actually go to the group-based licensing model, switch to the M35 group will be more scaling. As at the beginning, many people just say, hey, okay, this is strategy, we all agree, start from small group of people who aligned membership into the security group. But because security group has nesting structure, so very often we heard, hey, I got this access, but it spent tons of the time for admin to figure out why this person get license, which is out of the scope. Then, based on all the learning, we switched to the M35 group as soon as possible once we identify the strategy to roll out in the scale way to the company. By doing that, the connection between engineering and the business is still there to get consistency, to get agreement. But then engineering is in charge to make sure the license is assigned to the right people. And by doing that, actually engineering can share with readiness team and communication team who should receive the welcome email. They also can guide the global help desk in the proper way to let them know how to do the troubleshooting, how to answer user question in the proper way, which resource and contact will they really reach out. So that is one of the learning. And the secondary is the automation of the licensing. Many often, once the admin really get lots of learning, iterating, and they start to see a pattern, see the connection, so they will propose, how about we automate? Regarding how much automation we will reach out,
Ideally, the entire life cycle can be automated. For example, not only manage the license, but also the email can be triggered to the employee who got licensed automatically. But this needs a discussion with business. Will this experience really satisfy employee? Depends on how many information we want to share. Also depends on the user learning curve. Because we clearly can see before user get license, the first day they got license, couple of days after or couple of months later, users' understanding and interest or their needs are different. Depends on their knowledge, depends on how deep they are in that. So later on, not only really align license, but actually we really differentiate what need to be automated versus what need to be manually managed by collaborating with the communication team, change management team, to make sure the experience is well landed to all the employee based on their learning curve, so we don't randomize them, but also share with their information on the right time to fit their needs. Last but not least is the license prerequisite. So once we manage the license, very often we also need to check on the Copilot side, do we enable the plugin? Do we enable the web content? There's tons of the discussion with legal, HR to finalize that. In addition, because as David just mentioned, Copilot also really respects what information and data every individual already can get access through the graph. So we need to revisit all the M365 portfolio setup, is that really fit user needs or not? So typical example is if the Copilot refer to the meeting transcription, do we have all the policies set up for people to use the meeting transcription in the seamless way? And we review all the policies and the relevant service on the tenant as one step to check the tenant hygiene, in addition to all the governance and the setup. So by doing that, the learning for us is this is definitely admin will need to enable the license, but because Copilot also introduced new technology to user, we need to think about change management, communication all together end to end. So by doing that, I will hand it over to David. He will have a deep dive on the governance guardrail.
Yeah, and on Thursday, I'll talk about the meeting transcript conversation she talked about, because that's one aspect of it. One of the big things that we learned was meeting scenario is a killer scenario. That catching up is a really useful thing. Help me answer questions, help me take notes, help me get action items. The challenge is, of course, you've got to allow recording on your tenant, or just choose to go Copilot only mode. We can talk about that as well. But point is, some things to think about when you're configuring it. But let me talk about Copilot from a content perspective, because I think, I want to be clear. As an IT organization, and it's interesting, because of course I'm Microsoft. I work for Microsoft. I work for the company that makes these things. At the same time, I've got to be a customer of Microsoft, and I've got to be compliant, as we talked about earlier. So that means my expectation is I have to be enterprise ready. I have to have enterprise grade products. And Copilot actually met that out of the gate. It was enterprise grade in a lot of the core things we're looking for. And a good example of e-discovery, every prompt is written to be effectively available for discovery purposes. So I can find out if I need to do a discovery purpose, I can figure out who did what. All audits are available. I know exactly who did what after the fact. And more important to this conversation, at least for me, is the fact that Copilot will automatically respect permissions of everything. It's not going to show someone something they don't have access to, but it will show you something that the person does have access to. It will reason over that and come back if it's the right answer. So which means that the next thing is getting access right, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go here today. The other aspect of this, which I think is really important, at least from my vantage point, is data delineation. I really want to know what matters. I want my employees to understand what matters. And Copilot's going to both respect that. In other words, if content is labeled with rights protection label, which by the way is now our internal default, if you have a rights protection label, we'll be able to answer that question and pull out content. But if a content is encrypted that says do not copy, basically block extract, it means Copilot will look at the answer and go, I can't read anything from here in terms of pulling it out. If a user can't copy content out, Copilot can't either. It'll absolutely respect that. It'll reason over the encrypted content, but it will not come back with an answer. It will simply say, the content is here, just like a search would do. So it's great from a label perspective. The other part of this is it's going to show the employees what the label of the highest content was. So if the answer was rather sensitive, or in the case of this example on screen, moderately sensitive, what we consider confidential, it's going to come back with that and say, now the chat's considered confidential, here's the references you're getting. Everything about that is going to be basically shown, and that the whole chat is going to be labeled as that from now on. But an aspect of this is very important, is that it's going to use the file label, the document label in question. It's not going to use the SharePoint site label. It's not going to use the meeting label, which means that getting labels at the file level becomes really valuable to make sure that if you want your employees to see the label on the summary, if you want to respect the label, whatever it is, make sure that the label is coming to the files themselves. I'll talk a little bit more about that. The point is, enterprise grade from the start as we get going in this. So how I kind of think about this, and I summarize the story up in 10 steps. Now these 10 steps are how I think about it, how Microsoft internally, we think about if I'm going to recommend to another customer, what do you want to think about when you're deploying Copilot? These are things I think about. Of course, everyone's going to be different in terms of whether these things matter to you. How you do each of these things will vary, but these are all kind of key things I think about, at least should be part of your conversation when you're planning deployment of Copilot, especially if you're worried about content oversharing, risk, or anything else about, is Copilot going to answer questions with right content, stale content, potentially in content that a user shouldn't see. It's going to respect all that, but therefore your data estate needs to be well managed. So these are all aspects of managing the data estate. The first principle that I think about on this one is, first of all, data must be in the tenant in the first place. I want employees to create a new SharePoint site, create a new team, create a new project, whatever they need to do on the tenant, and I don't want them reusing things. If project 2 is similar to project 1, but slightly different in terms of people, in terms of risk or reach, or in terms of label, don't put it in the existing SharePoint site. Go create a new site for that. I don't care if I have lots of SharePoint sites. That's fine. At least the right roster for each site will be available. The right protections will be available on each site. The right label will be available. So we, at least internally, let employees create SharePoint sites. Now, I don't let just anybody create. You have to be a full-time employee to be able to create something, and I'm going to hold you accountable to what you created, but I'm going to let you create the site in the first place. And that allows someone, therefore, to be able to get that content directly in SharePoint where it should be, directly in the team, and now I can have a Copilot that's going to have access to that content appropriately, and all the right things are going to happen. The point is, in the tenant, even working externally, by the way, is what I want. I don't want that email to go out the door with a file attachment. If it's more likely that it's a collaborative project across company, bring the others into our tenant, let them collaborate in our tenant. You want to share a file with some standards body? Great, share it from the tenant. At least that way I can recall it, I can permission it, we can audit it, all the right things can happen. So we let our employees do things on our tenant, but with guardrails, with controls, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The other aspect of this that's very important around with self-service, for me anyways, if I'm going to let any employee create anything, I better know how important that is. I better know that this SharePoint site is really sensitive, and this other one, yeah, it's okay, it's all company, it's meant to be a portal, it's fair game. But if I can't differentiate, how do I know when someone is potentially overshared? How do I know what risks exist? And so for me, labels is a big part of that story, but that means getting a label schema in place that makes sense to employees. And by the way, we've gotten it wrong at Microsoft, and I'll talk about we've literally had a schema called high business impact, medium business impact, low business impact. And guess what? People would say, I'm an important person. Well, I guess everything I do is high business impact. No, it's not what that's for, but okay. So make the schema make sense to employees. But the other big thing of it, there shouldn't be too much choice. It needs to be employee understandable, employee settable. And one of the things that we think about is kind of Optimally, maybe 5 by 5, 5 parents labels and groupings, 5 children labels. And of course, that may vary, but point is there's going to be choice. It makes sense to the employee, and it's not going to be too overwhelming for the employee. And yes, I'm going to have divisional labels, so there's going to be hundreds of labels of a tenant. But as an individual employee in, say, LinkedIn or Xbox or other parts of the company, you'll have different labels from other parts. And so at least things are scoped to you. You'll see the right things appropriate for you. We'll make sure the right protections are there if we're going to follow through. So those are all aspects to how I think about labeling and with divisional labels and so on. But don't follow the mistake we made where your label schema is something that is meaningless to your employees. It's got to be clear. It's got to be understandable. So from our vantage point, I'm sure many have seen this, basic schema, very simple, but also at the same time, kind of obvious, right? Highly confidential is what it says. It's need to know data. If we protect it. It's not meant to be shared with everyone in the company. In fact, even confidential is not meant to be shared with everyone in the company. Lock it down appropriately. But highly confidential has the basic need to know, literally add specific people to things. Do not kind of share broadly in any way, or even large security groups shouldn't be on highly confidential. I have a 5th label too called non-business, but that's kind of out of scope for this conversation. Point is, top level labels make that sense to employees, make them clear, make them obvious, make them meaningful. So the next thing about this is what I consider kind of container labels. Do people label every file, every email in your tenant? In my case, they certainly didn't. We tried, we've labeled for years. Microsoft's had them Azure Information Protection and then Microsoft Information Protection and Purview for what, a decade now? We maybe got like 4 or 5% file labeling on the tenant, realistically. Now, granted, it was probably really important stuff with auto labeling and stuff in place, but you really weren't hitting that threshold of high label usage. But what we did have though, is something we've rolled out several years ago and has been baked into Purview now. It's the container level construct. Every SharePoint site, every team, every group gets labeled. I have almost 100% of all my containers, all my storage estate effectively labeled from a SharePoint perspective. The value of that is that now I can differentiate that highly confidential tented project that maybe IT doesn't even know the name of a tent from some maybe more a divisional site versus some maybe wide open site. I can now tell when something is potentially permissioned badly because I've got that container label. And those container labels in Purview provide basic policies. The obvious ones being things like, yeah, it must be membership managed. In other words, you can't just jump into it. It's got to be private. The other big one for me anyways is the guest sharing policy. I mentioned earlier, I allow guests in a tenant. It's not the default. If you create a SharePoint site or team by default, it's going to be what we call confidential internal only, meaning it's going to block guests. No guest sharing, no guest membership. Nice and straightforward, lock it down. But if you really want to, you can lower the label to something like confidential internal and external, or general, to then allow broader collaboration and broader purposes. And the other thing that's new, it's coming soon to Purview for everybody, is the notion of label inheritance, which for me becomes that thing that gets my label numbers up. That if that SharePoint site is labeled as highly confidential, that new file, that changed file on that SharePoint site is also going to get labeled as highly confidential. Now there's a sub-label and we map the container to the child, to the item label, but point is we do that in Purview. It automatically sets the default library label in SharePoint to say that highly confidential internal only SharePoint site, the site's locked down. The file is also going to be locked down with a rights protection label that is meant to be tenant only. If it leaves a tenant, whether by email or anything else, it's rights protection is going to follow the file. And so for us, this starts to drive the numbers across the board because fundamentally that provides a lot of a foundation. The way I think about it, it's the 99% case. You know, a lot of people talk to me about, well, how do you auto label and how do you manage labels everywhere? And I come back and say, auto labeling is great for 1%. It's the things that really matter. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But the 99%, the vast majority of a tenant, let it start with what the employee believes. Let it start with what the tenant says is the default for that location. This is a highly sensitive project. It's a tented project. Great. Let's make sure it's labeled appropriately. Now, the business, the owner can change that, but at least it's going to start in the right spot. And this table doesn't show all the labels we have. We have a lot more clearly, because there are divisional labels, for example, and so on. Board of directors has label. So everything gets labeled, but point is, fundamentally, it derives from a container. And one of the cool things here is, for us anyways, Purview supports now this with Loop as well. So more and more file types are getting labeled, and it's an excellent thing from a data estate management and protection management. And it's coming in a lot of other places as well. And for me, it's a good thing for making sure I can protect the data estate well. But then there's the other aspect of this. Actually, let me talk about training for a second. I forget which order I'm in. So training your employees is the other important thing. Because I mentioned that I want the employee to get it right, I need to make sure they're informed, because a part of a challenge here is that technology is only part of the answer. If an employee talks about something in the wrong place, well, that's not going to be okay. If someone takes a picture of a screen, not okay. So make sure employees understand how to handle sensitive data. Make sure they understand what the labels mean. So we have internal training. Annually, full-time employees must do. Security training, employees must do. You're allowed to create things. You're allowed to manage things. You're going to be trained on what these things matter. You're going to get that security training that tells you, here's what highly confidential, internal only means. Here's what it means when you label something as MS extended. And by the way, these are important things. And by the way, this also applies to meetings, which I'll talk about on Thursday as well. So these labels apply, and we train our employees to get it right. So, but it's a trust but verify model, that I want to trust my employees to create the SharePoint site. The labels will then default on the files. They may change them, but that's, again, all of a trust model. But verify is now at 1%. It's the things that really matter. An example of that in Microsoft is credentials. I clearly care about passwords and secrets, obviously, certificates and everything else. We're going to look for those things. We find those things, we're going to nuke them. We're going to just lock them down. As an example, credit card numbers, all the other standard things you'd expect us to need to look for, we look for. We've got policies, we've got DLP policies to block in many cases, or quarantine in cases where we've got very aggressive policies we may auto-label as opposed to just trusting what the employee did. But again, that's the 1%. So that we can make sure we are enabling our employees to be successful, but at the same time, effectively checking their work. You want to make sure that as a company, you have a reasonable confidence of what's going on and protect the things that must be protected. So, and by the way, one other aspect of this is, especially with auto-labeling, and especially with some of these policies, which can be very aggressive, we always roll it out with an exception policy, which says, I'm going to roll it out to everyone except for these groups. That way, if someone comes along, some VP comes along and goes, but I need to do this anyways. Okay, we'll put you in this exception group. This DLP policy will not apply to you. That's how we can then manage a broad rollout with exceptions. Because certainly in my world as an IT organization, there's always exceptions. IT wants to have nice straight lines, everything clean. No, someone somewhere is going to get an exception for something. We need to make sure we have a process for that. We can make it work. Everything's true. Everything is acceptable. It can be accepted in some way. Even labeling, like I mentioned earlier, that highly confidential container label that blocks guests. There's a highly confidential internal and external label that doesn't block guests. That's an exception label that only IT can apply. Because that way we can say, you want to partner with this really top secret chip manufacturer? Okay, no problem. But we're going to make sure it's going to be set up correctly. The SharePoint site or team is going to get labeled as highly confidential, internal and external. And we're going to rights protect everything with both parties. But we're going to do the right thing there. We're going to make sure we enable it and the exceptions are in place for the tenant. The other aspect of this is lifecycle management. That's really important to think about. How do we keep only what matters? Because at the end of the day, yes, I can protect all that stuff. It gets really important to protect all that stuff. I can organize it. I can have it labeled appropriately. I can detect when it should be protected. But I don't want to have things that don't matter. I don't want to have a site sitting around that no one cares about. In my world, one of the things we really do is everything that exists, a full-time employee is allowed to create something, but I'm going to take it away if they're not accountable for it. So I'm going to make sure I do attestation for everything that exists. I'm going to have a life cycle for everything that exists, at least in Microsoft itself. So, and we've learned in some ways the hard way that when there's no accountability, things can go wrong. So we're going to have an accountability for everything that exists within the company. Otherwise, we take it away. A couple of good ways to do this. Today, Entra has this group expiration policy. You can put that in place. We used this for a long time to do expiration for groups. SharePoint Premium now has this inactive sites report that you can use and run a job to basically collect attestation from those. SharePoint Premium is even going to go further on that. I think it announced this week of how far they're going to go. So attestation is going to get much, much easier directly in product. In my world, because I need attestation not tied to activity, I do things like I have a custom solution. You can build an Azure solution that crawls your tenant. We do exactly that. We crawl our tenant. We do basically do the same thing that the Entra policy does and send a notification saying take action to renew your stuff. When they do so, they're going to get an attestation screen. That attestation is going to basically say, you're going to check your membership, you're going to check your label, you're going to confirm that you are the accountable owner. We're going to hold you to 2 owners. We're going to make sure that you've got the right people on this thing. Or, again, we're going to take it away. And the other thing that is in product directly are things like the external membership. Entra has this access review policy that you can run to say, you've added a guest to this group, you're going to have to reattest that that guest should still be there. SharePoint has the access review policy to say you shared a file or a site with a guest, you have to reattest that that guest should still be there. Those are all things we have turned on so we can manage our tenants in an appropriate way. On Thursday, I'll talk about group membership management and how we manage role-based groups, because obviously as a tenant, you'll have organizational groups, you've got groups based on HR attributes. Sometimes we want to manage those to make sure the right people have access to the right stuff. I'll talk more about that on Thursday around how we do what we consider group membership management. But of course, Entra has dynamic groups as well for that purpose, and entitlement packages as well is the other way to kind of handle who should get access. The point is, good lifecycle management pretty much for everything. Membership, lifecycle, it all should be there for all the assets that exist. So, one other thing, and this one's going to be counterintuitive. So when I first heard of this, what was considered a people in Microsoft link at the time for us internally, a company shareable link, it scared me like nothing as an IT guy. It's like, what do you mean I'm going to have these links that can be passed around? And isn't that dangerous? But then you think about it, and when we realized, we tried it, and we learned, we saw a pretty dramatic shift in that what were employees doing before? You're trying to share a file with 20 people. Okay, well, these 20 people are in different groups. Well, what security group has them all? Oh, this all full-time employee group. Okay, great. You drop that all full-time employee group there. Or I drop that everyone except external users group in SharePoint. It's like, no, please don't do that. That's exactly what we don't want. But it's the easy answer. Employees, what we find is employees take the easy path. So I want the easy path to be an IT acceptable path. So for me, the IT acceptable path, in many cases, is going to be allowance for a people and organization link. It is counterintuitive because it is a pass-around link. But here's the thing, especially for Copilot and Search, unless someone was specifically given that link, such as an email or Teams IM, they're not going to, or redeemed it, they're not going to see it in Search or Copilot. Meaning that the whole company isn't going to see it, even though you sent around a people in Microsoft, a people in organization link. It's only the people who were directly received the link are going to see it in Search or Copilot. And that's a far better story than someone just sharing with some giant security group. Now, that's not to say it always should be a company shareable link is okay. A people and organization link is not okay, at least in my world, if it's highly confidential. One of the things SharePoint and Preview supports is the ability to set what the default link is. So I can say that highly confidential file or that highly confidential site, it defaults to specific people, or people I choose, not everyone in organization, or not people in organization, which means it's no longer a pass-around link. But that's for highly confidential, what really is need to know, and you should never have used a security group anyways. So in that scenario, I'm going to lock that down, and I look for that. But again, enabling company shareable links, not intuitive, kind of IT anti-intuitive in some ways, but it proved its value for us. We know exactly where our risks are, and what we found is this lowered our risks, which not something I would have expected had you asked me 6 years ago. The other side of this is it's kind of understanding your data estate. I mean, part of the challenge is, and I talked to a lot of people about this, it's like there's a lot of fear. Do I have oversharing on my tenant? Where do I have broad access that maybe I shouldn't? Well, SharePoint Premium can do some of that. You can get a report of everyone except external users on the tenant and see who was granted that permission in the last 28 days. That's great, I've got that. But at the end of the day, I need to understand everything. I need to understand every link, every permission, effectively every ACL across the entire tenant. I need to know that so that I can also understand, and I feed that basically joining the sites reports with the group membership. All the files of a tenant. I extract all this via Graph Data Connect into our own data lake. Then we also pull in even data from effectively shared channels. We can tell exactly when a team has been shared with, a channel has been shared with a team on another tenant, even if the membership's now on the other tenant. That comes back for our reporting too. So I literally can say, where does joecontoso.com have access to anywhere in my data estate? I can tell that because I got the entire Graph Data Connect extract. I can see exactly what the user's access. And just as importantly, I can run reports that basically say, show me all the sites that have failed my rule. And my rule, by the way, is there should be no large security groups. My definition of large is 5,000 on any highly confidential site. Great, I can see that. I know exactly where I've got a problem. Now, the data here, in fact, I show it on screen, I got 263 highly confidential overshared sites. Is that good? No. But when you consider I got 600,000 plus SharePoint sites, the fact that I know I've got 263 that I need to burn down, great. It helps me understand my data estate, understand where I need to go burn down, and therefore I can take action to do so. But had I not had this, I'm effectively in the dark as to what's really going on my tenant. Where do I have oversharing? I can now say with confidence that, yes, I have oversharing, but I know exactly where it is, I know exactly how bad it is, and I know how much I'm going to deal with it. And so for me, this is a big aspect. And the nice thing is, SharePoint Premium is taking this exact same Graph Data Connect reports and data sets and bringing them into SharePoint Premium. So the stuff of today is basically you have your data team do that broad extract of data through Graph Data Connect and pull it all in and join it all together. Well, great, SharePoint Premium will help you with that. It'll get it much easier. The point is today and now, I have to go do this extract. It does exactly what I want there. I can figure out exactly how bad the problem is, and I can manage the entire data estate. And so for me, this becomes really important. By the way, I can also see where did someone actually use that people and organization link against a highly confidential file? Where do I have highly confidential files on general sites? I know all that. I can see the complete view of the data estate because I know exactly where I've got a problem. And for me, that gives me confidence to say, Copilot, I know it's going to be fine because at the end of the day, those permissions are being well managed, and if they're not, I'm going to know about it. Now, of course, I have to then take action to do so. Some of those other things I make owners do, I make them remove large security groups to places they shouldn't be. But again, we know about it, we can go deal with it. So that's kind of how I think about it. And I'll take some questions in just a minute. But Eileen, why don't you sum up this whole part of the story?
Sure. Actually, when listen to you go through those best practice and principle, that helped me actually to recap all the internal practice we go through, all the discussions, and very important, going like a case by case study. So that is quite impressed. So you already see the 10 step at the beginning. We want to quickly recap here. Also, the quick recap for me. 3 important things for us to share. First thing, we encourage our employee to leverage the workspace for collaboration. And then we require and guide employee to manage that properly, for example, label the container properly. And we settled on the labeling in the proper way for them to easy to execute, and also set up the default label to make things easier for employee. Last but not least, we trust the people to use it properly. Same time, we set up the guardrail to revalidate how the thing's working on, monitor the progress, and then turn around to further evaluate if we iterate approach or not.
Yeah.
David, is that the right way to summarize?
Yeah, no, it's a fair way to summarize it, because I think at the end of the day, that allowing your employees to use, you get the full value of the Copilot. Now employees are going to see the things that matter to them, the things that they're working on. You've opened it up, but you also know that overexposure, at least it's going to be a known quantity, not an unknown quality that IT is going to be scared about. So those are all things that we think about on this one. So, and there's a lot more with respect to this, how we did all this.
So we touch base 2 points, like implementation and governance guardrail. As you can see on the screen, we published a blog which summarizes the end-to-end internal deployment practice for you to refer. It includes other information. For example, the adoption, the support, or other change management detail. So highly encourage you to read, and also if there's any question, we're happy to take it.
Yeah, and so there's that core thing. There's a ton of other content. Like the interesting, unique thing to being Microsoft's IT organization. So we have a privilege of effectively being customer zero. It's also the pain of being customer zero, because we're learning before anyone else. We're going through evolution with our product partners and how it actually works. So we try to share where we can. Obviously, we have day jobs to just run our own tenant, but we try to share where we can stories of how we did these things. So there's a lot more around how we manage. The deck will be available with links, so you can check out these stories to kind of figure out what's what. There's also a hub that's going to be available.
Yes, hub is available as of this morning, and you can see the information about how Microsoft does IT. And this will be built upon all the feedback, and you will see it evolve.
Yep, and along with the broader
More
adoption.
Information.
Yeah, the broader adoption story, and please, I mean, give us feedback. Like, the funny thing is, I'm not a product engineer. My job is to run Microsoft itself, and so we give products a lot of feedback. We try to make it right, but I'm hopeful this was useful. We'll talk more about how we govern our tenant and other aspects of governance on Thursday, because there's a lot more to what it means to run a large enterprise tenant than just some of the things we talked about today. But I'll talk about some more of those at least on Thursday. But please give us feedback. We really appreciate what you've learned, what you want from us, how we can do better. So those are all kind of key things. But why don't we do some Q&A?
Hey, you just mentioned sensitivity labeling through this talk. I was wondering, are you guys handling signed files which are being encrypted internally? Do you have solutions for that? Or do you know if somebody's working on it? Because it's, as we all know, it's currently not working. That, for example, that you have a DocuSign file and you want to encrypt this, then you have this library of encrypted files, but the DocuSign files are not encrypted there.
Right, so files, whatever the third party is has to know how to decrypt the file. So yes, like even our file default, when I save a file now to a confidential internal only SharePoint site, or fairly soon to my OneDrive, it's going to default to a rights protection label, confidential Microsoft Extended, which means only tenant. So as soon as it leaves a tenant boundary, that rights protection is now going to kick in, of course. No one's going to be able to decrypt it if you're not a tenant member. Now that means, though, that opening those documents needs to be done via a product that understands rights protection. So if you're Adobe, PDF understands rights protection. PDF is actually one of those file formats that does support encryption, and the PDF viewers, some of them support full encryption. But back to your point on DocuSign and others, the third parties have to integrate with rights protection libraries in Purview to understand how to decrypt and work with those libraries. And so, but it's again up to the third party, the ISV, to make sure that they're partnering with Purview around that rights protection. And definitely would encourage more to do that, because from our vantage point, I'll basically say this: look, third parties are going to lose access to Microsoft corporate data because it's going to be rights protected. So if you're not going to work with protection, you're not going to work with Microsoft data. That's how we're going to proceed. I'm going to be pretty aggressive about that, because our tenant, we care about rights protection a lot. We've now seen just how significant it is. Rights protection is going to be one of our big deals.
Hello. You mentioned the labels inheriting, the container labels inheriting the properties. So you said the files would get inherited from the container label. When is that on the roadmap?
It actually is out on our tenant now. It exists. Purview, actually, I was asking to Purview that exact question. Purview is right now in progress to roll that out. I'm not exactly sure what that date is. My understanding from my Purview partners is it is in flight to do that. Right, one of the things we used to do, for a while we were doing these scripts to basically set the doc library default. SharePoint's had that ability to set the doc library default for the last, 8 months or so. Purview's been supporting that at least from, and so we've been scripting it out at first. Now it's literally a purview configuration. Initially, it's going to be done via PowerShell and eventually the UI, but you'll be able to say the container, in fact, this table shows it. So container label is confidential inter only, file default is confidential MS extended. Highly confidential inter only, highly confidential MS extended. So in our case, that mapping is configured in Purview directly. When it's going to land, I think that's an excellent question for my Purview partners to talk about. I'm using the tech, I'm not releasing it, so I'll let them talk about when exactly it's going to hit. It's already on my tenant though.
Okay.
And so that should tell you, hopefully, it's at least line of sight.
So is it going to work like it's working now for the library defaults, where the existing files are not going to take any labeling, but the new files that come into the, let's say, the site or the library, so it's going to work the same way?
Yeah.
Is it?
So new files added to the library will take, unless they're labeled with something manually, they'll take the new label. Edited files, unless I have an explicit label on them, will take the label.
But existing files will still...
Existing files, if they're not edited, if our files are not edited, they're going to remain unlabeled.
Right.
So one of two things has to happen. Either you need to edit those files, or that's where you can script it out. Like one of the things that I do is, you know, let's say I've got a tented project, a really secret project, and the project team comes to us and says, I've already got all this existing stuff, help me. And so we will run scripts and PowerShell, just basically take a library and go, everything in this is now this label. So we will basically bulk label a lot of things.
That's what we do too, right. I thought maybe there is a new way where it will get all the older files too. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think, but here's the thing I'll also mention is, one of the things I find, getting greenfield right, you know, all the new stuff, it helps dramatically. Like my numbers in just 6 months of turning on container labels, and not even everywhere, but just part of a tenant, I jumped from like 4% to 12%. And when you consider the entire totality of a universe of Microsoft files in just a few months, it was actually a pretty good, impressive win that, yes, I'm not at where I want to be. I have a very specific goal of where I expect to be by the end of this calendar year in terms of labeling. And yes, I'm going to have to bulk label some libraries where it's really sensitive and it matters that all the existing stuff is labeled too. But the other aspect of this is, since I do aggressive lifecycle management, a lot of those old sites are also going to go away, at least in my world. So I'm going to make sure that all that new stuff gets labeled, and where I have to, I'll bulk label, or we'll get rid of it.
Hi, David. Thanks for the great session you had. From a Microsoft IT perspective and Copilot, what applications do you actively block, like Loop, Copilot Studio, or anything else? Do you see any danger in collecting too much data out of the tenant, and what is your point of view for that? So we'll talk about Loop. Loop, first of all, has a lot of goodness to it. Loop components are fully compliant in terms of their work with labeling, their work with protection, all of the SharePoint controls, all there. If it's a Loop component that you share in a chat, for example, in your OneDrive, everything in Loop is going to be 100% compliant. I don't worry about Loop components. Loop workspaces get a little more nuanced because it's basically on top of SharePoint embedded. But point is, that's also SharePoint compliant from the perspective of lifecycle, all the DLP policies, all the abilities are still there. Additional couple things I'm still waiting on from Loop workspaces are coming. But point is, Loop is still Copilot compliant is how I think about it. So yes, you asked a great question, because I do think about that. I do not want data to come into the graph effectively if I don't know that it should be there and potentially is overexposed. You know, I have conversations with people around, well, why don't we bring in this external data from some other source that we don't know if it's clean? I'm asked that question of, well, if I don't know if it's clean, why would I bring it in and connect it? Because now people are going to find stuff. So back to that question, even with Copilot Studio, I'm going to moderate the end result. There's going to be an IT approval process to say, yep, like we're okay, this is fine, but we're going to check to say, yes, this data source is okay to come in, or no, it's not.